All right. The Thy Darkened Shade is a Greek black death metal band, and well, let's call them a black metal band in spirit and process. And Liber Lucifer II's Mahapralaya is a very long-awaited return for the group. The previous part of this examination of Lucifer throughout various spiritual and cultural phenomenon in various different forms is really it's an especially fine set of work, if we look at all three of their full lengths. And this is a band that I sort of emphasize the fact that there was no real formative period where Thy Darkened Shade uh, showed their development process. And I don't, I feel like each album has been of a certain quality, of a certain time. And the first one definitely, you could probably sit down and say, well, I can hear the Abigor influence in it and whatnot, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. But the more important thing is that there's a, a real spiritual connection with the music here that is exuberant. It's and I don't mean in a fun way. I mean there's a sort of proclamation, um, a reveal of the self in all of this work that we don't find very often in any sincere sense in terms of Luciferian, satanic, extreme metal, where there's an actual literary and intellectual exploration of the subject matter, but also in a very poetic way from an artist who is very accomplished, very technically capable, and practiced in everything they do. I, it's it needs to be said up front that this is what a band that a lot of people have considered technical black metal in a lot of ways, and it's led to a little bit of strange comparisons to like Decibel Omega and whatnot, and I wouldn't place them in that kind of category uh, beyond the fineness of the work, which makes sense. It is technically sound. It is very expressive, and the entire experience is made to be grand, enormous, and revelatory. So we really only ever see what Thy Darkened Shade wants us to see and hear. And in this sense, they put on a grand sermon and exploration throughout this album, which is uh, perfection. There's like, and I don't say that as an opinion. I mean that this is the artist's idea of a perfect as can be, having worked on this album for quite a long time. So uh, there's a couple of interesting notes in here beyond this spiritual side of it, and you can read all about that in the review. I actually go into it more than I normally would because I think it is such a fine part of this discography. But the thing to mention is that he's always had the best drummers for the occasion. He's always had the best lyricists who are willing to put more of themselves into it. They're all putting their own vocals into it. So there's a lot. You can tell that this what became tedious at some point in creation, and I think that's where some of the best work comes is when you are tying off every piece of what you're doing. And so, well, okay, what does all that mean to anybody? Well, in practical terms, you're getting an album that is influenced by 30 plus years or about 30 years of listening to heavy metal music. And that means you will get some of the first wave or the classic heavy metal feeling from some of the presentation. You'll get a lot of the early 90s black metal guitar constructs, the different like tritonal melodies and things like that, and techniques, which you'll also find in bands like Nightbringer. But these are maybe more buttoned up, a little bit less freewheeling, but no less sourced from a really personal point of view. So uh, it is more than that by way of the really fine bass performances, which you'll think that the main performer and songwriter Semjaja. I'm not going to pronounce that right. Shemjaza, is that right? Um, he is a fantastic bass player. You'll think that he brought in like a progressive metal bassist in here, since he does bring in Hans Grossman for the drums, who does a fantastic job on here. But the bass work is so just incredible on this record, and I could not pull myself away from it. I probably still listen to this album every day since I received it, because I do think there's something to be said for not only the connection with the spiritual aspects of it and the finesse of the writing process, but actually the performances. And that's a really important part for me, is because everything is considered, but it's also done to such a high standard that it's hard to go back to the more pedestrian side of black metal when I've been so steeped in this thing. It's a similar reaction I get from a lot of the bands that I mentioned in the review, like Abigor or Nightbringer, and these are obviously very fine uh, constructions. And so, uh, there's so much to explore and to know about this album. I think that it would only do it justice to give it a very high recommendation and say that a lot of these are best moments that are best had on your own and parsed to yourself. What I will say is, when I call a black metal album a great work, I don't do that very often, and I think it's because this is a particularly special and inspired thing to come from the greater black metal mindset, and it hitting so early in the year has sort of, it's just been a lot to consider when whatever comes next to get anywhere near that score is going to have to be pretty impressive. And I try not to compare, but this is a pretty high standard to set in early January. So we'll see how that sticks around throughout the year. There's a lot of review in there to check out and a lot of details to consider. So go ahead and read it yourself and listen and see if that's your kind of thing.